Alright, so a while back, and I mean a while back.
One eternity later.
Alright, I apologize for taking so long to address the topic, first off. I was given an interesting topic to address by Daniel in the comments of a previous video. Alright, so Daniel says, "Hear me out. Context is king. What is up with the Bible story about Jesus and the three kinds of eunuchs?" The comment is between a passage about divorce and Jesus' command to allow the children to come to Jesus. Honest question. This subject may require wearing the hat. Nailed it. Daniel also says, thanks, this passage about divorce, eunuchs, children. So he's referring to the kind of sandwich of context going on. You have eunuchs in the middle, and on each side is divorce and children. So, how does that work? Has always intrigued me, and I can't find much scholarly info on it. Awesome question, Daniel. And as Daniel shows, it's a pretty tricky passage. You got divorce, eunuchs, and children. So how's the context going to help you in that one? And that's what we're going to explore today. So, the topic is on the eunuch passage in the Gospel of Matthew. If you need a quick refresher before we dive in, I suggest maybe pausing the video and giving yourself a little quick time to get acquainted with the passage. The question, I believe, was over the three kinds of eunuchs, and especially concerning how the context of the passage works with what seems like a random discussion out of nowhere about eunuchs, which is a great example of strange passages you have to deal with as a modern Western reader. And also, how do we apply the context to our interpretation of a passage with these more challenging verse situations? Especially this verse, I can see, would be a pretty difficult one, because really anything about eunuchs in general is pretty strange to us. I mean, when was the last time you met a eunuch? Probably never. I don't even know if it would be legal to make someone become a eunuch today. Ow! Although, on the other hand, it is today, so maybe now that I think about it, yeah. Anyways, let's get into the text and see what's going on here. I'm Nathan Collins, bringing you the truth of Christ in a post-truth culture. But before I begin, I would like to take a moment, of course, and thank all of you who support this effort on Patreon. Mike and I are very grateful to all of our supporters. Thank you, seriously. All right, if you need a little refresher to the passage, I'm going to kind of read through the eunuch passage more specifically. I'm not going to read the before context or after. I'm just going to assume that you paused it or that you're just familiar with it already, because we only have so much time. So anyways, jumping in here, verse 8, we are coming off of Jesus talking about divorce and him saying that the only reason that they were allowed to permit divorce was because of the hardness of their hearts, but it was never what God wanted. And then Jesus gives the exception to when divorce is permitted. And the disciples' reaction comes up in verse 10, and this is sort of what leads into the eunuch passage. So the disciples' reaction is not positive to this teaching of Jesus. In fact, they're kind of upset about it. The disciples said to him, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." So the disciples, you can tell that the context of Judaism of that time was not okay with what Jesus was saying. Okay, at least the disciples' tradition and culture was not okay with this strict standard of having to be married to a wife. And the only exception to being able to get a divorce was this exception. They're not okay with that. And they're saying if that's how strict it is, that once you're married, you're pretty much married to this woman forever. If that's the way it's going to be, it's better not to marry. If this is the only exception to get a divorce, which tells you a lot, again, about their culture and what was going on in the disciples' world at that time. So we think today's bad, but obviously theirs was way worse about divorce. So verse 11, we're going to go into Jesus' response, and this is where the eunuch talk happens. Verse 11, but Jesus said to them, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this, receive it. So, Jesus is saying, not everyone is able, though, to not be married. Only to those whom it has been given. So, if the disciples have not been given that, then they shouldn't try not to be married just because they don't like what Jesus said. And then it goes into the children passage. So it is kind of weird because it's pretty abrupt. It's like, then the children were brought there. So this is the little eunuch passage brought on by what the disciples say in verse 10. And this is kind of what we're going to be looking at. And then we're going to kind of go into the greater context of the passage of divorce and marriage and then you have children down here and how the eunuch passage goes along with that. All right, if we look over here, you'll see it's the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. And this is a kind of classic multi-volume work that gives a more in-depth view of how the words in the New Testament were used outside the New Testament, how they were used in the Septuagint, which of course is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and how the word would be used in the New Testament, of course. And usually they have some information on the early church fathers. So here's some information from these scholars, and they talk about how it's used outside the New Testament. So you see number 1 here kind of mentions that. It talks about how this word eunuch can be talked about with animals that are being castrated, or it can be talked about for vegetation, fruits or plants that have no seed or kernel, which of course makes sense. They can't reproduce. And so the general term has to do with lack of reproduction. Castration is alien to the Greeks, but found in the Near East. And we see this a lot in the Bible with the other Near Eastern cultures. We also know this from history, that if there was any men who attended rich women of rulers especially, that the attendants that were men anyways would be castrated or not, made in a way not allowed to reproduce with the rich women that they were serving. And this played an important role for the reproduction of the king's line or the ruler, whoever he was. That stuff was very important to them, that their blood would continue on and that type of idea. It was also used in cults for certain temples and certain gods. The men may be castrated. The priests that are there may be castrated to dedicate themselves to that god. The Old Testament, of course, forbids this kind of castration, as obviously be fruitful and multiply, doesn't really go with that. And then there starts to be some leniency. They're saying it seems to be anyways, by the Hellenistic period. You got Herod's court officials, where there's some eunuchs there mentioned, and Josephus talks about them. So it was something that was around then, of course. Rabbinic Judaism, they're saying, definitely was against being a eunuch, as of course you couldn't be fruitful and multiply type of thing. But what the Jews thought about this was not completely just one thought. There were some that allowed being a eunuch or saw a place for it, but there was, of course, the other side that said that it was a terrible thing to do and was very anti being a eunuch or anybody who's a Jew being a eunuch. So there were those two thoughts. It wasn't completely just as straightforward as this is making it out to be. All right, so we get to the Matthew passage here, Matthew 19:12, which is specifically talking about our passage. So let's see what the dictionary has to say. It says, Jesus transcends the rabbinic view by differentiating three groups of eunuchs: those who are so from birth, those who are castrated, and those who emasculate themselves for the kingdom's sake. So you have people who are just born and they can't reproduce from birth. They're just born that way. So some sort of deformity or thing like that. Then those who are castrated, so those who become a eunuch for some purpose. They're working in the temple or the court of some official, and so the official requires them to be castrated to do the job. And those who emasculate themselves simply for the kingdom's sake. So these are people, the last one is people who sort of like a monk in a way. They are doing it for the kingdom's sake. They're dedicating themselves to the kingdom of God, and they are emasculating themselves, which would mean not reproducing. Remember, being a eunuch generally has to do with just the idea of not reproducing. Doesn't always mean that you are castrated, but that you're not reproducing. You're not getting married. You're not reproducing. In the latter case, the sense is obviously figurative. The reference is to those who renounce sex in order to focus on the higher goal of the kingdom, sort of like monks and things today, as Jesus himself does. The gospel affirms the natural order, but may require its denial for the sake of the new and higher order. So this is sort of what they're saying is kind of the meaning behind these eunuchs, these three eunuchs. All right, and then, of course, eunuchs are mentioned elsewhere. There is a weird story, which is probably false, about Origen. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, but he is a famous early church father, and that he took this passage in Matthew 19:12 like super literally or something, and that he castrated himself. Literally, not figuratively, as they're saying in part 5 here, but literally. Now, I think that this is not true, that this is false, because it's kind of written about from a person who didn't really like Origen, and so that kind of, sometimes they exaggerate to make somebody else look bad. So I don't really think that Origen really did that, but some people think he did. So this is sort of some information here that kind of explains the general usage of the word. It's always good to look at a dictionary, see how the word is used outside the New Testament, how it's used inside the New Testament, and it'll sometimes give you how it's used in the passage specifically you're looking at, which is fantastic. But we're going to kind of keep looking at some more information on this passage as well. Let's discuss this idea of eunuchs a little deeper so the idea is really grasped here. Eunuchs like the Ethiopian eunuch, who was an official in the royal women's court, would have been a person who was castrated to become a eunuch. Others, though, adopted celibacy for religious reasons. Some people like John the Baptist or Jesus, as well as Paul. And we see this in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 7 through 9, where he once again says that this gift was given to him. So going back to the passage in Matthew where it says, to whom it has been given, right? So Paul is saying that he has been given this gift. Some groups of Judaism believed that celibacy was a higher spiritual calling. Some within the Essenes group were celibate. However, like with anything, not all Jews saw celibacy of being a eunuch as being a right practice, and some viewed it as a straight-up defilement to become a eunuch. The use of the word eunuch and the idea behind the word is not a comfortable idea of being castrated. It would have been just as uncomfortable of a word to many first century Jews in the first century as well. To not be able to procreate was a terrible and accursed lot in the eyes of many Jews. To have no future generations is to have no name that will live on. You were as good as dead and forgotten. The three reasons one is made a eunuch by birth most likely has to do with physiological incapabilities of procreation. This understanding is seen in the rabbinic sources of Yibam and Zabim, where they go over similar terms expressed by Jesus like man-made eunuchs and eunuchs made by nature. Also, the making of someone into a eunuch, this was seen through deliberate castration of men back then to give safe attendance to a married woman or harems. This was widely practiced in the ancient world. The Old Testament, however, did not approve of this pagan practice, as seen in Isaiah and Deuteronomy. Again, the third type of eunuch that Jesus describes is one that is made that way for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. This is seen as a eunuch made by choice through the choice of celibacy. Remember, the term eunuch simply means to not reproduce. It doesn't always have to do with castration. So this is why there are these three different meanings. They're using eunuch in a very different way than we might be thinking it should only be used. Celibacy was a choice based on the belief that this is God's will for their lives. These three reasons are the most evidentially supported ideas for what was meant in the first century when talking about the term eunuch. It has to do with not being able to reproduce. Now, for a side discussion, much of the discussions of the Western world today and the 21st century suggesting homosexuality with reference to those who are born eunuchs is completely anachronistic. And the evidence for such a belief is hard to find, and that is an understatement. It is unbelievably hard to find because it's not there. The category and the making of all the various sexualities of the 21st century Western world, for one, would have been a completely alien idea to the ancient world. So much so, it would be its own episode easily in explaining their thought process because it would be so vastly different than the West today. So needless to say, the whole homosexuality debate on this verse is completely an imported idea from the cultural controversies of the West today and have nothing to do with the original meaning and historical context of the New Testament. This is always a big pet peeve of mine, whether conservative or liberal or whatever. I can usually smell the stench a mile away when someone is obviously importing something into the text and torturing the Bible to say what they want it to say. Don't do it. Don't bring your cultural baggage with you as much as you can, please. So as you can see, if we zoom out and look at the different pericopes, we can see that there is this pattern here, and there is a reason for their placement. We're talking about family, the basic unit in society, in the society of the kingdom of God specifically. And in Jesus' kingdom, he talks about marriage. He talks about not being married as a possible way that you could live as your own unit. But then he also talks about children, which of course is part of the family unit. So this is a context of the family unit in the kingdom of God. Thus, the different topics being talked about. Whether your family unit is simply yourself, because that has been given to you by God, or a married couple with children. And that could also be a family unit in the kingdom of God. So this is what the context is here, and this is why the placement is here. Hopefully that makes sense and answers some of the questions you may have about this weird eunuch passage. But also remember, there is also the other passage after the child passage, or the children passage, that talks about the rich man in contrast with the lowly children. So there's also that piece as well. Hopefully that was helpful. I enjoy this kind of thing, and I'm sure more than one person was curious about this passage. Like I said before, eunuchs are exactly an everyday thing in our time and part of the world, so it's kind of understandable why this would be a strange passage for us to try to grapple with. Well, that is all for this episode. I'd like to say thank you to Daniel for the great question and to my Patreon supporters. We are blessed to have you, and you keep the lights on here, so thank you. All right, if you're wondering what were some of my reference books that I kind of dug into, or my other sources, I of course used Accordance. Accordance software is a fantastic tool. You have a whole digital library on there, constantly gets updated with anything that the editors want to add to each one of those books or texts or commentaries or what have you. So it's a fantastic source. But also use the gospel commentary here. It's the Nicent, or it's not as easy to say as Nikon, but that's the Old Testament. So Nicent, this is the New International Commentary of the New Testament. It's really fantastic. There's tons of detail in it. Did a great job. And also the Illustrated Bible Background commentary. This is fantastic, multi-volume source to go through. It's got lots of good tidbits on everything and really good stuff. So if you feel like blowing a bunch of money, there you go. Spend away, my friends. If you're new to this channel and you'd like this episode, go ahead and subscribe, visit our page on Facebook, and check out our other episodes as we address different issues in our world and bring you the truth of Christ in a post-truth culture. Grace and peace, brothers and sisters.